Kinder, een filmmaker die een film heeft gemaakt over de Batavia, interviewde voor ons in Fremantle de directeur van het Maritime Museum. De directeur vertelt levendig over zijn passies en de 4 Nederlandse schepen in het prachtige museum. En hij verklaart waarom er rondom wrakken meer koraal is dan gewoon in de zee. Hij staat voor de overblijfselen van zijn favoriete project, de Batavia.
My name's Ian MacLeod and I'm the executive director of the museums in Fremantle. But by training, I was an electrochemist. Well, I still am a chemist. And people say, what on earth is an electrochemist doing in running a museum? And the answer is electrochemistry is all about interfaces. It's about metals and non-metals sitting in a solution. And in the case of the Batavia behind me, it was a wooden ship and it was sitting in the ocean, in the Indian Ocean, when it got wrecked on the Abrolhos Islands about 30 nautical miles off the West Australian coast. And so this happened in 1629, which is before my time. But over time, what happened was the iron in the cannonballs and the cannon, they corroded. But the corrosion products act as a nutrient for the marine organisms because in the alkaline seawater, they're desperately looking for iron for their energy to drive their mitochondria. And so when a wreck comes along with cannonballs and cannon, they go, wow, great stuff. And so they double or triple their growth rate. And so very quickly over space of 4 or 5 years, this blanket of coral encapsulated the Batavia. So it's a bit like the story of Sleeping Beauty. She pricks her finger on a spinning wheel and goes, oh, into a sleep for 100 years. So the Batavia slept for almost 350 years until the archaeologists came up and woke her up. And so what they did, they peeled away this layer of marine growth, and underneath it, there was this remarkable treasure, not only of cannonballs and cannon, of iron, but also of bronze and artifacts that had been trapped as the vessel collapsed. And so in there, you've got remains of sailors' hose, their stockings, and you've got seals used by the predicant. You've got every possible piece of life and death incorporated on the wreck. There are 4 VOC shipwrecks off the West Australian coast, and in the Maritime Museum down at the bottom of Cliff Street, you've got material from the Batavia, which was 1629, the Fagulda Draak, 1656, the Zoutdorp, 1712, and the last but not least was the Zeewick in 1727.
Why do we have so many Dutch shipwrecks on the Western Australian coast?
It is, well, the popular myth is that the Dutch were no good as seafarers. Now, I have to dispel this myth. The Dutch have always been absolutely brilliant sailors and navigators. But the problem is the West Australian coast, because you have fringing coral reefs that are very low-lying, and when you're sailing along, particularly at night, you have no idea until suddenly, crunch, you run into the coast. And normally by that stage, it's too late. And so that's what happened to these 4 famous Dutch shipwrecks. They simply ran out of water underneath their keels. In the case of the Batavia, virtually everyone survived the actual shipwrecking. But when they got ashore on Beacon Island, what happened was Commander Francisco Pelsart took the ship's longboat all the way up to Batavia, modern-day Java, and to get a rescue vessel. And while he was away, Geronimus Cornelius, who was the man in charge highest up in the company, he went sort of a little bit mad, or very, very mad, and he killed 125 men, women and children. So half the ship's complement were killed. And today, it is still the most notorious maritime mutiny and massacre ever told.
So
The shipwreck material that's been recovered all needs specific forms of conservation. In the case of the oak timbers behind me that formed the Batavia, they contained up to 400% water in them. And you say, how can you have 400% of something? Well, and that's because if you weigh the wet timber and then dry it in an oven, the wet weight is 4 times heavier than the dry weight. And so without impregnation with water-soluble polymers, that apparently solid timber would just go and shrink almost to nothing. So what we have to do once we've stabilised the timbers is keep them in the right environment. So this gallery is controlled at 50% relative humidity.
fantastic. Can you tell us what is the latest shipwreck found that's in the museum?
The most recent colonial, as it's called, from Western Australia, it was a colony, it was around about 1898. So after that, in 1901, Western Australia became part of the Commonwealth of Australia, and so shipwrecks less than 75 years old are not deemed historic.
Do you have a special ship, your favorite ship in the museum?
Well, it's a bit like with children. You're not meant to have favourite sons or daughters, but I guess your firstborn is always very special. And so it was the need of developing conservation techniques for material recovered from the Batavia that brought me to the museum with my background in electrochemistry. So my job was to conserve a composite gun from the Batavia. And there are only 4 of them in the world. And the methods for conserving bronze guns would destroy an iron one and vice versa. So I had to develop a new technique for conserving this mixture of iron, brass and copper. And it's still stable 36 years later.
Right. And is there a ship out there that you would like to rescue or discover?
Well, yes, indeed. There is a missing VOC ship called the Achterkerk, and there are hints, very subtle hints, that it may also be wrecked in the Abrolhos Islands. But where it's believed to be is right on the edge of the islands and the deep water. And so waves come pouring in from South Africa and go thundering crash into the reef. So maybe once or twice a year, the water goes, and is calm. And so try to be there at that time is a bit tricky. The reason why conservation of artifacts is important is that we can't go back in a time machine, much as people would like to do. Doctor Who can do it, but I can't. However, I can journey back with the artifacts and peel back the layers of corrosion and work out what happened to the objects 150, 200, 300, 400 years ago. And therefore, you interpret that decay and you make it available in stories to the public. And then we know that here were these objects manufactured for various purposes, brought on as cargo onto the ship, then got shipwrecked, decayed for 350 years, and then we've conserved them. And without the conservation, the objects would simply fall apart, and all the pain and suffering of the artifacts would have been lost and in vain. So therefore, although many Dutch people died on the West Australian shores, the decay of the materials that were left behind are like a living memorial for them, and so their lives were not lost in vain. Their lives are here, still living now, all these hundreds of years later, to bring a sense of history and identity to the West Australians who visit and to all our international visitors who just stop and wonder and are in awe at the skills of the VOC sailors in getting their ships and doing their trade. The plate, it's a pewter dinner plate from 1697.
Okay.
Willem de Vlaming was a Dutch explorer, and he came up and found Dirk Hartog Island, and Dirk Hartog's plate was on a post up there, and it said in Dutch, 1616, I'm Dirk Hartog, I've come here on my ship, the Endracht, and and I'm here. Yeah. And so he picked up that plate to take it back to France as a prize. And he got shipwrecked in the Falkland Islands and saved the plate. So in 1945, the plate, having landed in France in the 1820s, came back to Australia, and then the federal government gave it to the Western Australian Museum because they said it belongs here. So now this plate is in a special case, machined out of solid aluminium and in an argon-filled environment. I think in today's digital age, one of the things that we face is how to capture people's imaginations. And so, our museum web team do great work. And in fact, we've just won national awards for Australia's best government website. And people visit it from all over the world, and something on it will capture their imagination. And they'll go, oh, wow, I never thought of that. And it may take half a generation or half a lifetime, but they will come. They will come to Western Australia to be able to see the real objects that captured their imagination as a child or as an adult. And so here, museums have the real thing. And to be able to come up and touch an artifact from hundreds and hundreds of years ago, or if you're feeling stressed, to go and hug a cannon or put your eye against it and feel all your tension drain away. Man, that's a unique experience and something that you can't get from an iPhone or an iPad. We've got inside the museum a skeleton of one of the victims of the Batavia massacre, and you can see a chip out of his skull and the slice where his throat was cut and then whack, chopped through his shoulder blade. And so, if you want gore, yeah, we've got it. But if you want beauty, we've got some exquisite objects. But if you want evidence of consumer protection in the 17th century, we've even got that, because the Dutch put lead seals with stamps on them that attested to the material, who manufactured it, and what it was dyed with. So in our galleries, we've got these early 17th century consumer protection devices invented by the Dutch. It's brilliant. He's in it that arrived 50 years later and got shipwrecked. So it's like a real detective story that we can tell. It's not Hollywood, it's not made up by a scriptwriter. It's made up by history and by people's real lives. And that's where the compelling power of the shipwrecks is.